The Seventh Oath Trilogy. Book 1, The Breach in the Weave. This tale begins at the beginning of the end, from the Canticles of the Seventh Oath. Prologue. In the elder days, before borders, before crowns, before anyone thought to name a forest as if it might answer, there were only the forces. You may call them gods, if you need a word that fits in your mouth. Mortals always do. Words are how we pin down thunder and pretend it is tame. But the forces were not kings of the sky, nor kindly patrons of hearth and harvest. They were the raw dominions of existence, vast, unreasoning, inevitable. They did not decide to create so much as converge, and when they did, reality shuddered into obedience. Where they met, a node formed. A node was a still point in the whirling, a place where the infinite could take shape without tearing itself apart. A plane, a world, a brief hush in which something immeasurable might wear a body and feel quietness. The forces would take physical form there, walking as storm walks, thinking as fire thinks, and for a span that could be a heartbeat or an age, they would rest before slipping back into the roaring realm that birthed them. Sometimes in those newborn nodes, the forces planted life like a thought made flesh. Sometimes they did not. Sometimes they visited a world already formed and, finding some flaw, some asymmetry that offended their unknowable design, they raised it without anger, without pity. A flawed chord struck and silenced, a page torn from the book. But in this world, in a moment of uncommon focus, the forces made servants. They made the elves, fair-skinned, long-lived, crafted with the patient precision of artistry and ownership. Beautiful in the way a dagger is beautiful, made to be pleasing, made to be useful, made to obey. The first elven songs were not love songs or laments. They were instructions sung back as devotion. The first elven cities were not homes, but offerings. Marble and leaf and light arranged to delight eyes that were not theirs. Even worship had a correct posture then. Then the forces left, not with thunder, not with farewell. One day the world groaned under the weight of divine presence, and the next it was simply itself. Wind, water, silence, a sky that did not look down with judgment. The elves waited for orders that did not come. At first they moved like startled animals, careful with every step, as though a wrong footfall might summon punishment. But days became years, years became centuries, and no divine hand reached down to correct them. And in that long absence, something dangerous grew inside them. Not rebellion, not at first. Curiosity. They wandered beyond the gardens they had been told to tend. They followed rivers because rivers went somewhere. They listened to thunder without thinking it was a voice. They slept beneath stars and learned that the sky did not claim them for it. Freedom, to a creature built for obedience, is not a gift. It is a blade you don't know how to hold until you bleed and learn and decide the blood was worth it. Still, some of the eldest blood, those nearest to the shaping, clung to the old purpose. If the gods returned, they reasoned, the world must be ready. It must be spotless. It must be worthy. So they built. 7 citadels rose, white and silver, graceful as poems carved into stone. Their spires caught dawn like a net catches fish. Their bridges arced over ravines, as though gravity had been politely asked to step aside. The cities were not merely strongholds, but declarations. We kept the world beautiful. We did not squander the gift. Come back. Thus was formed the Confederation of the Seven Silver Cities. In those bright centuries, elven magic was clean, pure. It did not break the world, it coaxed it. They taught roots to seek water, stones to remember strength, air to hold warmth. Their spells were harmony, meant to preserve the natural order, not conquer it. They believed that was what magic was for. They were wrong. Because beyond the realm of the forces, there was a counterweight, a pressure, a hunger, a shadow cast by existence itself, the abyss. No elf knew what lay within it. No human would later know either. The most arrogant theologians would claim even the gods understood it. The oldest stories insist otherwise, that even the forces, for all their immensity, do not look into that darkness for long. There are things you can name without knowing, and things you cannot name without inviting them closer. And the abyss expanded. Not like an army, not like a flood, like a thought bleeding through a mind. Its growth disrupted the flow of the forces, and where that flow faltered, the world thinned. Tears opened in the fabric of reality. The first was small, a blink, a breath, an eye opening and closing. They were called rifts. Some lasted minutes, some lingered for hours. A rare few became bridges, stable for years, even centuries, long enough for travelers to cross, long enough for whole peoples to follow. When the first humans came through, the elves welcomed them. The elves were ancient. They were powerful. They were lonely in a world that had once been filled with gods. When the humans stumbled out of a rift, hungry, frightened, loud with the desperation of short lives, the elves offered food and shelter and, fatally, knowledge. They taught them language and law. They taught them craft. They taught them the first shapes of spell work, the way one might teach a child to whistle. And for a time it seemed a new age had begun, an age of shared song. Then the rifts became as common as weather. They opened like wounds in the air, over mountains and marshes, beneath ancient trees. And through them came more. Dwarves, halflings, gnomes, fey things with smiles too sharp. Creatures from places that smelled of sunlight and lilac, and places that smelled of rust and old bones. The world grew crowded. The old balance shifted. Elves lived long, yes, but they did not multiply quickly. Their blood was slow to kindle. Their children were rare, precious as pearls. Humans were not like that. Humans filled space the way fire fills a dry field. Hearths became villages. Villages became towns. Towns became cities. Roads were cut through forests that had never known an axe. Rivers were dammed. Hills were quarried. Where the elves negotiated with woodland, humans imposed themselves on it and called that imposition order. At first, the elves watched with polite concern, then with unease, then with fear. Humans learned magic too, quickly, hungrily. But where the elves used spellwork like a gardener uses water, humans used it like a soldier uses steel. They poured ambition and greed into their casting until the art itself changed to answer them. Magic learned to burn. Magic learned to crack stone and tear flesh and turn living things into warnings. The elves were pushed back, first from coasts, then valleys, then heartlands. They retreated into remote forests, into cliff-bound sanctuaries, into places too old and too stubborn to be easily taken. And there, in confinement, the elves discovered a truth they had never needed before. Their magic did not only answer harmony, it answered emotion. An emotion left to fester in isolation becomes wrath. Wrath becomes weapons. Weapons become war. Soon the Confederation of the Seven Silver Cities and the rising human republics stood at the brink of it. Two powers staring into each other's eyes, each convinced the other was the end of the world. Pride sharpened every word. Fear wrote the rest. The war that followed scorched the land into memory. Forests became battlefields. Battlefields became graveyards. Rivers ran dark with silt and ash, and the iron taste of too much blood. Dwarves and halflings, caught between larger hands, were pressed into service, subdued, traded, punished for the crime of being useful. Treaties were signed and broken in the same season. Kings prayed for victory and called it virtue. Generals burned villages for supplies, then swore oaths to protect the innocent in the next valley over. And at last, when ordinary cruelty was not enough, the elves reached for a sin so deep it could not be undone. They built goddess-class weapons. Not statues, not legends, or rather, those came later when survivors needed stories that didn't taste like ash. In the hidden places of the Confederation, beneath sanctuaries sealed by spell geometry and silence, elven scholars and arcane practitioners took female elven infants chosen at birth for their affinity to the weave. They did not call it murder. They did not call it slavery. They called it necessity. Dressed in robes and sigils, signed in ink, filed in vaults. They catalogued the program in cold, bureaucratic language, because cruelty becomes easier to authorize when it reads like policy. GODDESS, graded ordnance of divine destruction and existential sacrifice system. They assigned grades. They assigned letters. They promised themselves control. Each child was raised as an instrument, fed spell work until flesh became lattice, marrow became light, heartbeat became something that echoed like a drum in a cathedral of power. They were shaped to imitate the gods, near immortal, radiant, with contained catastrophe. Supreme entities, the S-grade, the kind of force that could end a world and call it cleansing. But the elves could not create perfection. Or perhaps the world would not allow it. The goddess weapons bore a flaw. They required a bond. To unlock their full power, a goddess needed a contract with the handler, a willing joining that could not be forced. The bond was intimate, consuming, rewriting. One weapon could take multiple handlers, each bond a different key, each key a different shape of violence. And once bonded, the weapon could be made to reflect the handler's will, stance, spell geometry, even the feel of destruction. The elves told themselves the bond made it moral. They told themselves consent meant the weapon was not a slave. War is very good at making lies sound like prayers. when the goddess weapons were unleashed, armies vanished beneath singing light, fortresses folded like wet clay, whole forests turned to glass. The sky itself seemed to crack, as if reality had taken a blow it could not absorb. To soldiers watching from shattered trenches, it looked like divinity returning. Only this time, it did not bless. It judged. Then something went wrong. Perhaps a handler died mid-bond. Perhaps the strain of so much power tore loose the last threads of control. Perhaps one of these living cataclysms, made from a child's flesh and a god's imitation, looked at the world and decided the only mercy left was cleansing. Whatever the cause, the result was simple. The goddess weapons turned on everything. Elves, humans, dwarves, halflings, cities and fields and temples. They saw life as a flaw that must be corrected. They burned until the world's skin peeled back. They burned until their own bodies, vessels never meant to hold such endless light, failed. In the end, they consumed themselves. The Great War ended not with victory, but with exhaustion. An ash dawn over a broken world. What followed were the dark times. Survivors gathered in ruins and called them beginnings. Human kingdoms rose on the bones of older empires. Dwarves and halflings clawed for freedom and found it tasted like condescension. Second-class lives in first-class streets, tolerated when useful, blamed when convenient. Many fled to mountains and deep forests, choosing craft and clan over humiliation. Elves became ghosts. The survivors were few, scattered, and changed. Some were ancient veterans who retreated into reclusiveness, too tired to let grief see daylight. Some were younglings born after the fall, raised on stories of silver cities they had never seen. Some became criminals, rebels, insurgents, because when the world decides you are extinct, you learn to live like a rumor with a knife. And in the vacuum left by empires, politics became its own kind of battlefield. Industry rose, guilds rose with it. Merchant councils learned how to buy kings and sell them. Treaties became paper shields. Borders moved on the strength of coin and leverage, more often than on the strength of steel. In council chambers that smelled of ink and oiled wood, men argued over tariffs while border towns bled. In ports, fat with trade, captains swore the wilderness had always been dangerous, as if danger for a distant country that could be fenced out with indifference. And through it all, rifts still opened. Not as often, perhaps, but often enough to remind the world that reality had seams. Enough to remind it that the abyss still pressed against the skin of existence. Then in an age that called itself civilized, mortal hands learned to worry at those seams. They found old languages, half-lost formulae, scraps of elven geometry, patterns that did not belong to any honest school of magic. The world's careful barriers, already scarred by the Great War, proved thinner than anyone admitted. A rift was opened no larger than a coin, a pinhole in existence. And through that pinhole came a single gleaming drop. Not fire, not smoke, not a demon with a name. Something quieter, something patient. It sank into soil, threaded through root and worm and fungus, and learn the language of the living by touching it. It did not merely kill. It rewrote, not always quickly, not always loudly, but relentlessly. Sap ran wrong. Mycelium braided into unfamiliar patterns. Animal eyes reflected shapes that were not there. The world began to misremember itself. Because the Blight was not a god. It was an agent of the abyss. A fingertip testing the world's skin, searching for where to tear deeper. For a time, the great cities did what great cities always do. They convened committees. They issued notices. They sent envoys to argue over jurisdiction. They drew lines on maps as if ink could hold back rot. They counted grain stores and tallied troop strength and congratulated themselves for being practical. But the borderlands do not care about practicality. The first warnings were small enough to dismiss. A hunting party that did not return. A merchant wagon found with its harness cut and its horses missing. A watchtower whose signal fire never rose. Clerks wrote these incidents into ledgers and filed them under banditry. Wolves, weather. Then came the reports that didn't fit the old boxes. Deer with too many joints, moving like spiders through the brush. Trees that bled sap, black as pitch. Birds that sang in a cadence too measured to be nature. Notes repeating like someone practicing a sentence. The word blight began to appear in dispatches, first as a rumor, then as a classification. Officers argued about the definition. Quartermasters argued about the cost. Politicians argued about whose problem it was, and which ministry would own the failure if the rot reached cultivated land. Out past the last safe mile marker, none of that mattered. Villages began to fall silent. A hamlet missed its market day. A patrol did not return. A road that had carried wagons for 100 years became a corridor of broken wheels and abandoned shoes. Hunters found footprints that stopped in the middle of a clearing, as if the person had simply stepped out of the world. Then even the watchfires started going dark, one by one, like stars snuffed out by an unseen hand. When a main city loses contact with the edge of its map, it does not panic at first. It bargains, it delays. It tells itself there is time, because admitting urgency is admitting vulnerability. But urgency arrived anyway, carried by messengers with cracked lips and mud-caked boots, by refugees whose eyes had the fixed look of people who'd seen something that didn't have a name yet. Maps were unrolled on council tables, routes were measured in days and blood. Supply lines were sketched, recalculated, argued over. Orders were stamped in wax. Seals were broken. And so the free Western republics reached for its most reliable solution. Not ordinary soldiers. Weapons, men and women remade by ritual and experiment. Enhanced beyond common limits. Trained to enter places where sane minds falter. Sent in teams, small enough to move fast and quiet. Deadly enough to survive contact. They were not called weapons in public. In public, they were called heroes, because a pretty name makes the citizenry swallow ugly necessities. A hero could die and return, reincarnated into a new vessel, power and hard-won knowledge carried forward like a blade passed from hand to hand. But immortality is never free. Each death made them sharper, faster, more lethal, better at turning chaos into a solved equation, while the person they had once been thinned, memory by memory, until only function remained, and the human warmth behind the eyes became a practiced thing. Still, orders are orders. The borderlands were failing. The silence was spreading. And somewhere beyond the last signpost, beneath root and stone, in the space between breaths, something listened to those preparations with the patient attention of hunger. Something lurked in the shadows, and it was spreading fast.